The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the streets of the small town. I had recently taken over the local restaurant, eager to bring my culinary expertise to the community. The previous owner had left behind a collection of recipe books, and I was excited to explore them. One afternoon, as I was flipping through an old, leather-bound recipe book, a folded piece of paper slipped out from between its pages. Unfolding it, I read the hastily scribbled message, "Don't cook from this." The note sent a shiver down my spine. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in haste or fear. I looked around the empty kitchen, suddenly feeling very alone. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, the shadows darker. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was probably a joke or a warning about outdated recipes. But curiosity got the better of me. I began to read the recipe on the page the note had been marking. It was for a dish called the Chef's Last Supper. The ingredients were ordinary enough, but the instructions were odd. They were incredibly specific, detailing the exact time to add each ingredient, the precise temperature to cook at, and even the specific type of utensils to use. Feeling a mix of intrigue and defiance, I decided to prepare the dish. As I began, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see someone standing there, but the kitchen remained empty. As I followed the recipe, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered. The radio turned on by itself, playing an old, haunting tune. The air grew cold, and I could see my breath. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the feeling of dread grew stronger with each passing minute. When the dish was finally ready, it looked alive. The colors were too vibrant, the aroma too intoxicating. I felt drawn to it, compelled to taste it. But just as I was about to take a bite, the restaurant's back door slammed open. A disheveled man burst in, his eyes wild with fear. "Stop," he shouted, rushing towards me. "Don't eat it." I recoiled, dropping the plate. The man looked at the shattered dish and let out a sigh of relief. "Thank God," he whispered. He introduced himself as the previous owner of the restaurant. He explained that the recipe was cursed. Every chef who had prepared it had met a tragic end soon after. He had written the warning note after narrowly escaping death himself. I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. The man apologized for not being more explicit in his warning and thanked me for not tasting the dish. He'd offered to buy the restaurant back, but I declined. The experience had shaken me, but I was determined to move past it. The next day, I burned the cursed recipe book and held a cleansing ceremony in the restaurant. Business boomed, and the dark events of that afternoon became a distant memory. But every now and then, when the sun casts long shadows and the air grows cold, I remembered the forbidden recipe and the man who saved me from its curse. And I'm reminded of the thin line between ambition and danger, and the importance of heeding warnings, no matter how mysterious they may seem. The rain was pouring down in torrents, and the streets of New York City were nearly deserted. I had been driving my taxi for almost 12 hours straight, and I was eager to call it a night. Just as I was about to turn off my available sign, a man flagged me down. He was standing under the dim light of a street lamp, his silhouette barely visible through the heavy rain. He opened the door and slid into the back seat, his clothes dripping wet. "Drive," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could make out a pair of intense, piercing eyes staring back at me. "Just drive," he repeated. I hesitated for a moment, then shrugged and started driving. The city's neon lights reflected off the wet streets, creating an eerie glow. The rain muffled all other sounds, and the only noise inside the cab was the rhythmic patter of raindrops on the roof. After a few minutes, the man finally spoke. "Take the next left," he instructed. I did as he said, turning onto a narrow, poorly lit street. The buildings on either side seemed to loom over the taxi, their windows dark and empty. "Stop here," he said suddenly. I pulled over to the side of the road, and he pointed to an old, abandoned building. "Wait for me," he said, opening the door and stepping out into the rain. "Keep the meter running." I watched as he approached the building, disappearing into the shadows. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. It was just another fare, I told myself. Nothing to be afraid of. But as the minutes ticked by, my anxiety grew. What was he doing in there? Why had he brought me to this desolate place? Suddenly, the back door opened, and the man climbed back in, holding a small black bag. "Drive," he said, his voice even more urgent than before. I didn't ask any questions, I just drove. The rain was coming down even harder now, and the streets were slick and treacherous. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. "Turn here," he said, pointing to another narrow alley. I hesitated for a moment, then turned the wheel, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. The alley was even darker than the street we had just left, and I had to strain my eyes to see where I was going. Suddenly, the man shouted, "Stop." I slammed on the brakes, and the taxi skidded to a halt. The man opened the door and jumped out, leaving the black bag on the seat beside him. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what was happening. What was in that bag? Why had he left it with me? Suddenly, I heard a shout, followed by the sound of running footsteps. I looked up to see the man sprinting towards the taxi, his face twisted in terror. Behind him, 3 figures emerged from the shadows, chasing after him. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, and the taxi lurched forward. The man reached the car just in time, jumping in and slamming the door behind him. "Go," he shouted. I floored it, the tires screeching as we sped away from the alley. The 3 figures were left behind, their shouts fading into the distance. We drove in silence for a few minutes, both of us catching our breath. Finally, the man spoke. "Thank you," he said, his voice shaky. "You saved my life." I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, my heart still racing. "What happened back there?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "I'm a journalist. I've been investigating a criminal organization for months. Tonight, I got a tip about a meeting in that abandoned building. I thought I could get some evidence, but they spotted me." I nodded, trying to process what he had just told me. "What's in the bag?" I asked. He opened it, revealing a camera and several rolls of film. "Photos," he said, "proof of their illegal activities." We drove in silence for a few more minutes, then he gave me an address. When we arrived, he handed me a wad of cash. "For your trouble," he said. I shook my head. "Just doing my job," I replied. In the waning light of dusk, the auto repair shop stood desolate at the edge of town, its rusted sign groaning with every gust of wind. The sun's final rays cast an eerie, almost spectral glow, making the shop's grimy windows and peeling paint seem even more foreboding. Inside, the overhead lights flickered, casting a dim, ghostly illumination. Alone in this unsettling atmosphere, I worked on an ancient set-in, its once vibrant paint now faded and chipped. The owner had complained about a malfunctioning radio, and given the car's age, it wasn't surprising. I turned the radio on, expecting the usual static of an old device. Instead, a deafening white noise filled the room, its intensity making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried tuning it, but the static was relentless. Frustrated, I switched it off and began to dismantle the dashboard. From the oppressive silence, a voice emerged, quivering with fear. If anyone can hear this, please, you have to help." I recoiled, my heart racing. The voice was unmistakably that of a young girl, and it dripped with raw terror, and it was emanating from the radio, which I was sure I had turned off. "My name is Emily," the voice continued, each word punctuated by sobs. "Someone's taken me. I don't know where I am. I found a way to send this message, but I'm so scared." A cold dread washed over me. This couldn't be a hoax, could it? The sheer terror in her voice was too genuine. "Emily," I whispered, even though I knew she couldn't hear me. "Try to stay calm." The static hissed for a moment before her voice returned, fainter this time. "It's pitch black. I think I'm underground. I can hear the muffled sounds of traffic. There's a sliver of light from a window, but it's out of reach." Panicking, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers trembling. I relayed the chilling message, and the dispatcher's voice betrayed her own alarm. She told me to stay put and that they were on it. But then, The unmistakable sound of the garage door creaking open echoed through the shop, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. My mind raced with horrifying possibilities. Was this the person responsible for Emily's plight? I quickly hid beneath a workbench, clutching a wrench for some semblance of protection. The footsteps grew louder until they stopped right next to the sit-in. A long, tense silence ensued, broken only by the soft crackle of the radio. Then, a familiar voice called out, "Is anyone here?" Peeking out, I recognized Officer Daniels, a local cop I'd seen around town. Relief washed over me. "I picked up the transmission in my patrol car," he said, his voice strained. "Stay here. We got a lead on the location." Days turned into weeks, and the town was abuzz with the story of Emily's mysterious message. I was swamped with reporters and curious townsfolk, all wanting to see the miracle radio. But the weight of that night hung heavily on me. I hadn't been the hero. I was just a witness to a chilling plea for help. Emily was eventually found and rescued, her abductor apprehended. The town celebrated her return, and her bravery became legendary.